Fog arrives in San Francisco as if the city forgot to finish its sentence. It rolls down the hills and squeezes into alleys. It flattens neon until the lights look like memory. Zara Bennett hadn't planned to come back, not really, not until the call that said Aunt May was gone and the house was hers by law and by a family reluctance that felt like old wallpaper. Thin, stubborn, and peeling at the corners. She came back because paperwork is a good excuse to sit with grief and because San Francisco at 5 in the morning is honest. It looks like the rest of your life, stripped to concrete and salt. The cottage on the edge of the Presidio kept the smell her aunt had been proud of: tea and lemon oil, cedar, the softer dust that collects when you let a home settle. It sat under a stand of cypresses like a thing deliberately small. Inside, May's things lay where a life had finished arranging them. A row of chipped teacups, a polishing cloth folded exactly twice, a stack of hardcover books with notes in the margins. Zara ran a thumb along May's old reel-to-reel recorder on the writing desk and felt the tide of memory pull. She had been a violinist once, and then the world had asked her to translate sound for movies and installations, to make what a room felt like audible, to sculpt silence as much as noise. Her life had become an art of ears, mixing, editing, teaching. That was why, when she pried open a small envelope tucked beneath May's favorite mug, she wasn't surprised to find a reel of tape, not a letter. Old tapes, her aunt had taught her, kept their own weather. This one was labeled in a hand she recognized. May's too, the same tight slant used for recipes and condolences, and the single word on the cardboard ring read, Anchorage. At first it was just curiosity. She threaded the tape into the machine like someone making a promise. A hiss breathed out of the speakers and then a voice, low, male, hurried. "You can't just send me out tonight, Jory. We tested this last week. The pattern wasn't stable. The bridge's resonant channels." A woman answered, breath in the mic. Her voice had been recorded with the intimacy of an argument in a car or a kitchen where everyone is on the same night shift. Don't call it the bridge. Call it the gate. People will pay attention to that. The voice snapped the one odd word, gate, so hard Zara felt the hairs on her arms stand up. There was the quick shuffle of feet, a metallic clank, and then the hiss of wind, the low far sound of the bay that prefers to keep its moods private. The recording cut, and then, layered underneath like a bad memory, a pattern of 3 notes repeated, faint, like signal tapping at a distance. Zara leaned closer. Her thumb knew the shape of sound editors, the small, mechanical loop where a tape had been cut and spliced, the blue marker of a technician who wanted to mark a moment for later. On the margin of the tape box, May had scrawled a date, 1979. She didn't know the name Anchorage beyond the literal meaning, nor did she know why a tiny house in the Presidio would have tapes from 40 years ago, but the physics of curiosity is predictable. Once the ear finds a thread, the hand will tug. Zara thought of the Golden Gate in fog, of the way sound rides the cables and the water. "We tested this last week," the unknown man had said. Who had they told? Who had stopped listening? The next day, at a cafe on Chestnut where the napkins are cloth and the coffee is political, she met a man with a camera case and a face like a photograph that had been overexposed in youth and come back handsome. He introduced himself as Noah Reed, and he had the confident, bad habit grin of people who make their living by asking other people's quiet questions. "You're May's niece," he said before the coffee arrived. "You have her ears." He gestured at the small reel in her bag like a man marking treasure. "I knew she recorded things. She let me listen once, years ago, when I was a kid trying to build a film about the waterfront." Zara closed her hands around the cup. "You knew my aunt?" "No," Noah said, honestly. "I knew of her. Everyone in the old shops did. She kept things for people." He paused, watching the fog soften the light over the bay. "I come because I saw you arrive. I've been doing a documentary about the soundscape of the bay, about old maritime signals and the tech they used. If you want, I can help." He said the last 2 words like an offer that might be taken or not taken as the mood required. Zara read his face as she had learned to read microphones, the small catch in his eye that said truth, the way his fingers tapped the camera case when he was impatient. She almost said no. She almost folded the tape back into its cardboard and made a life of editing silence for people who paid. Instead, she slid the reel across the table and watched him accept it like a pawn. The first thing they did was bring the tape to a tiny sound studio above a boat repair shop in the marina, a place Noah knew because filmmakers know the back doors of the city. The studio smelled of solvent and coffee and a work ethic that's mostly patience. Noah threaded the tape on an old machine that whirred like a sleeping engine. The 3 notes returned, this time with the faintest, underlying echo pattern, not random at all. Marina gulls in the background, some kind of radio carrier faint and irregular, then the voice. "We trigger at 3, said the man. "It makes a channel." The test was supposed to be acoustic, no one wanted it broadcast. Jory said the gate would pick it up. Zara asked, "Rehearsed, who is Jory?" Noah frowned, thinking of the frame. "I don't know. A nickname? An engineer or a captain? Possibly. Anchorage could be a code name for the test location. In the 70s they ran odd experiments off the bay sonar tests, acoustic mapping. Old Navy stuff. Some of it got buried. Zara had a memory that uncoiled like wire. When she was 25 she'd loved a man who listened to the world the way she did. A maker of tiny instruments, a man who used sound like a hand. He'd vanished into a job that promised scale and returned like a rumor, distant and a little cruel. The relationship died in the small grief of distance. The island's silence of absences can make an ache with its own identity. For a moment Zara didn't say anything. The tape became a small, private funeral between heartbeats. Noah, sensing the pause, changed tack. "We should go to the Port Authority," he said. "Historic records, maybe the shipyard logs. There may be a mention of Anchorage. If it's tied to a shipping name, a freighter, a contractor will find something." It was the sort of practical sentence that encourages the cowardly to act without naming the fear. Zara agreed. They left the boat repair smell for the sour tang of the Port Authority building, the city's institutional scent, paper, coffee, bureaucracy polished to a bland mercy. The clerk at the records window was a man with tired eyes and a stamp the size of a future. He raised his eyebrows at the date on the tape and then, like everyone in government, asked for patience. In an archive room that smelled of cellulose and sleep, Zara watched spines of boxed records like a person in a library of old weather. On an index card she found the word Marigold, a ship name, a freighter built in 1969, registered for acoustic surveys 2 years after the label on her aunt's tape. "Marigold," Noah repeated. "There's a line. The ship went out on survey runs around the bay and then to Anchorage, Alaska, and then back. Someone in 1979 wrote a memo that said the bay experiments were moral hazards and recommended they be discontinued." "But who ignored the memo?" Zara asked. "They did not find the name on the first run. The stacks offered nothing but the precise sleep of official language where the word hazard sits like a polite accusation." Then, behind a ledger with rust marks and a postage stamp, Noah found a photograph. A grainy black and white print of a group of men on a deck with the Golden Gate in the distance. A small note on the back read, "Jory K. Tech Lead. Anchorage Test, July 79. The fog outside the windows seemed to draw closer, as if the city was listening. Zara looked at the photograph and then at Noah. For a second she saw in the grain of the print a face that could belong to the missing man she had once loved, ageable, yes, but the same set to the jaw, the same way of carrying weather. She told herself not to believe in ghosts and then did it anyway because city fog makes believing easy and necessary. When they left the archive the sky had learned the word gray in more than one register, and Zara felt, for the first time since her aunt's funeral, a purpose that tasted like salt, not just to tidy a life left behind, but to listen to a signal that had been waiting a long time to be heard. They had a tape, a photograph, and a name. Somewhere under the Golden Gate, the bay had kept its own records. Someone had meant for them to be found. Someone, possibly, had not wanted them to be. On the road back to the cottage, as the fog closed around the bridge and the cable lights leached their halos out into the night, Zara felt something shift in the air, a repeated pattern of 3 notes, far off and steady, as if the gate itself were testing whether anybody still cared to answer. She stopped the car on a pullout and listened. The city held its breath like a door waiting to be opened. The faint 3 notes threaded through the fog like a knock. Behind them on the hill, A figure watched from the shadow of a cypress, a camera low in hand, an outline not quite committed to reveal. Zara did not notice the eyes. She did not know then that returning had been an invitation or that the tape in her bag had been part of a conversation started long before she was born, a conversation the city had kept inside its bones. She only knew she could not unhear the pattern now. And that, sometimes, is the thing that starts everything. When a city wants to tell a secret, it rarely speaks in one voice. San Francisco whispers with cable car brakes, the bay sighs in currents, shopkeepers shout in abbreviated kindness, and the bridge, when it's not being photographed, keeps its own ledger in waves and tension. Zara found that ledger in patterns, in the reel she'd threaded, in the way a door snapped when you meant it to, and now, in the small mechanical insistence of 3 notes that threaded through fog and time like a cobbler's stitch. They began with the tape on the old machine in Noah's studio, because analog things reveal things different from digital ones. A splice shows itself in grain, a nick in the magnetic tape carries memory like rust, a background hiss is a fingerprint. The studio smelled of solvent, warm plastic, and an old coffee that had not given up on hope. Noah set the playback speed to half, then quarter, then back until a treble became a rhythm and the rhythm became code. "It's not musical," Noah said. "It's a carrier, a tap." Zara watched the waveform on his aging meter like someone reading someone else's pulse. Her hands remembered how to coax tone, how to coax a violin into confessing its secret, and that memory made her rigorous. She lined up the tape until the 3 notes resolved not as music but as pulses. Between them, a microsecond of silence. Between the silences, a pattern repeated, long, short, long, long, short, short, long, short, long. It read like a stuttered telegraph. If you were old enough to have loved shortwave, you started to hear intention where others heard only noise. "You mean like maritime signaling?" she asked. "No exact match to the current international code of signals," Noah said, frowning. "But older coastal codes used repeated blasts and bursts. Before standardization, people improvised. This could be a modified foghorn code or a sonar ping converted into audible range. If it's Anchorage, if that's a nod to Alaska, it could be a route marker. Or it's a private code. Someone took basic impulse language and made it theirs. They needed context. So they went where context had a roof, the historical section at the Maritime Museum, a place of damp prints and patient archivists. The museum smelled like varnished wood and salt. A woman with silver hair and an ID tag that read June greeted them with all the mercy of someone who'd spent her life cataloging the city's memory. "You've come for sound?" June asked, because the rumor of May's reel had pushed through a small network like a grapevine. They laid the tape on her desk. June cradled the cassette like a relic and then fed it into a playback bench that had belonged to someone who kept his palms steady. When the 3 notes came and made the room tilt, she nodded slowly. "Old Coast codes," she said. "Not Navy, not official. The shipping companies used coded blasts for rendezvous, less formal, more local. Anchorage would be a waypoint, sure. But this pattern," she tapped her lip. "This looks like a signature more than a waypoint. A repeated motif means someone wants to be recognized by someone who knows the motif. Someone who doesn't want an audience," Noah said. June smiled, not unkind. "The best messages hide in plain sight. We did it for foghorns and flags. Your tape carries the feel of someone who adapted older tech for something private." While they sifted through paper, June found a small ledger. Someone in 1979, typed, then hand-notated, had made an entry, "Acoustic survey runs, Marigold Freight, Anchorage. Jory K., listed as lead tech." Someone had added a margin note, "Do not publish, private contractors." Adjacent, another entry, "Aegis Marine, contract phase 2 with a company stamp." Aegis, Noah read aloud and tasted the name like a bad coin. He'd heard of them, a modern private contractor with deep pockets and deeper silences. They fixed boats and bought patents the way other people bought art. In the last decade they'd expanded into control systems, sensors, infrastructure consultancy, quietly. If Jory K. had been working with them or for them, a private test could be anything from an innocuous survey to a deliberate experiment. The ledger gave them a list of men and places and then another thing they didn't want. A phone number that led, not to a company line, but to a small, one-room operations office on Pier 58. Noah dialed with a finger's faith that made Zara admire him. She'd forgotten what it was to let curiosity be a public act. On the pier, an assistant with good posture and bored eyes told them nothing, which is how bureaucracy behaves when it's been instructed not to be curious. Aegis contracts haven't been out here in years, he said, as a way of verifying absence. Everything's corporate now. But absence is a map too. You go where the gap is thickest and pry, or you watch and wait for someone to lean toward it. That afternoon, walking along the water, Zara felt the city touch her back like a hand giving directions. She'd learned to like Noah by degrees. The way his smile came when he was surprised at a sound, how he cupped playback speakers the way other men cupped rare coins. He had a cinephile stubbornness and a doggedness that made mistakes seem like tools. When the wind cut across the bay, they both caught the three notes faint and distant, like a conspiracy humming between foghorn and fairy. You can map this, Noah said, unrolling a cheap diagram on a bench. His pen moved not like a man who guesses but like a man who sifts fact from rumor. If it's a private code, it will have anchor points. If we triangulate the reception, given current wind and tidal patterns, we might find where the source sits. They spent late afternoon tracing reception angles like cartographers making a small, vengeful map. The first intersection pointed to the shipyard near Hunter's Point. The next to an abandoned storage lot that now belonged to Aegis Marine, according to a zoning map Noah printed out like a paper trail. The third line led to an offshore buoy marking the old Marigold survey area. Anchorage was literal, Zara whispered. The word held a different weight when it belonged to a place and not a dream. They drove out to Hunter's Point in the sinking light. The shipyard smelled like oil and old heat. Men with veteran hands looked at them as one might look at people who had wandered into a fishing story and decided to stay. Rex, not the slotman this time, a different man with a different beard, leaned on a railing and squinted at their paper as if it were a confession he'd been hoping for. You looking for Jory K? He said. They were. The name had resonance in him too. He told them what little he knew. Jory had been a tech in the late 70s, an old-time engineer who favored tubes over chips. He'd been into acoustic mapping and had the kind of patience you don't teach in schools. Then he'd been gone. Not dead, just gone. A few men had left ports with him and not returned to their shifts. Rumor had coalesced like rust. Jory had taken work moving between shipyards and private contractors, and maybe, once, he'd pulled too near something he shouldn't have. On the pier outside Aegis Marine's lot, a blue sign warned that private property meant private business. The gate was guarded by a camera and a keypad. Their approach was not subtle, they left footprints. The security guard who answered was young and had a face that had not yet learned how to split truth from profit. Please, Zara said, making a voice that held both memory and a mild authority. We're looking into an old incident. We found reference to Aegis and the Marigold. Do you have any records? Contact logs? Anything from 1979. He blinked at the date as if it had been a wrong number. We don't handle records older than our acquisition, he said. Corporate policy. Corporate policy, Noah repeated as if filing it away. They left a card. People who hold power rarely throw it away. They keep it like a coin to show they were once necessary. But cards are also volleyballs you hand back to the world. There's always someone willing to set them for you. That evening, after a day that had felt like a series of small excavations, Zara found an anonymous note tucked beneath the tape case in her bag. The paper was cheap. The handwriting had the angularity of a person trained not to be known. 3 words, blunt as a nail. Don't follow the light. It was a sentence that smelled of warning and chess. Followed by a second line, in a different hand and a fainter ink, as if more frightened to be seen, he listened. She read it and felt the part of her that had once fallen in love with a man whose silence taught her too much go cold with recognition. Whoever had written it knew about listening, and they expected other people to be bad at it. Someone's watching, Noah said when she showed him later that night. He said it with the professional calm of people who'd made careers filming things and then realized the camera becomes part of the danger. They slept poorly in shifts. San Francisco has a habit of keeping its nights full of small weather, fog that moves like a cat, a ferry gonging in the distance, a rumor of footsteps in alleys. Noah kept his camera backpack in the hall like an offering to circumstance. Zara kept her tape on the bedside table and felt its bulk like a heart. The next morning they went back to the Marigold survey quadrant with a borrowed boat and a man who knew how to point at buoys without asking permission. The water that day was milky, gulls queuing for the kind of scraps a harbor teaches them to expect. They drifted along the line where receiver data had indicated the strongest ping months ago. Noah deployed a small hydrophone they'd borrowed from a university lab, equipment that listens in frequencies that passengers on ferries do not hear and which bridge cables carry like gossip. They recorded. For an hour the hydrophone made a map of water sound, prop wash, the low confusion of a tug, the distant mutter of ships. Then the three notes came through as if a body had moved through the water and left a wake of tone. This time the notes were not muffled by tape, they were immediate, honest, present. The pattern resolved in water as it had on tape, and beneath it, like a chord, a second layer of sound, a mechanical whine, bearing marks of old technology, a sound you could translate into gears and patient motors. Someone is replaying the signal live, Noah said, voice small as a radio. Or the old test is still running on a loop. Either way, it's active. They anchored for longer, sensing their smallness in a large and patient bay. On the horizon, across the water, the Golden Gate looked like a drawn question. On the far shore, somewhere between Marina and the city, the blue of Aegis's lot looked like a smile with teeth. When they returned to shore the sun had folded into the fog again. A duffel bag sat against Zara's porch steps. She touched it with the caution one uses before opening a complicated gift. Inside was a single photograph, a glossy shot of the Marigold's deck in 1979, Jory K. In profile, hair longer, face more weathered, certainly younger. On the back, in the same neat script, we shouldn't have tried to make the gate listen. No signature. Noah stood behind her when she read it, his hands in his pockets, the way men hold themselves when they do not know the proper degree of protection to offer. You ever have the feeling you're being invited to a conversation you'd rather not be at? Zara asked, and his answer was a look that made him seem older and wiser for the attempt. We can stop, he said. We can walk away. She thought of May's hands, of the teacups, of the way the tape had known not to lie. She thought of the man she had loved and how he was missing not because he had wanted to be but because someone had made him a question mark. She thought of Jory K. in the photograph and the margin note that said the test had been a moral hazard. She answered with the thing she always answered with, an inclination toward listening. Or we can keep listening, she said. That night, when the fog came up again to eat the city's edges, Nina, a woman who'd been watching from the cypress silhouette, moved further along the bluff. That was not important now, what mattered was this. Someone had decided long ago to make the bridge listen, and someone else had decided that the city would rather not be asked to speak back. Zara and Noah had found the pattern. They had no idea what it would ask of them next. But patterns have a momentum of their own. You follow the first, and sometimes you find yourself caught in the second. The archive smelled like the inside of a closed mouth, paper and glue, dust that had chosen to make itself useful. Rows of filing cabinets in the Port Authority's lower stacks were lit with bulbs so old they softened the light into a color you could almost taste. June unlocked a vault door with a practiced hand and a key that had the weight of someone who kept secrets for a living. She moved like a librarian who had learned to be kind without softening her vigilance. No one comes down here unless they already believe ghosts are people worth talking to, she said, and that line both comforted and warned. Noah and Zara followed, their shoes whispering on concrete. Noah carried the real case like it was fragile, which it was, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Zara had a small notebook and a pen whose cap she'd lost on the drive-in. She worried about little things to keep the big things from crowding her throat. June fed the tape into a deck that looked like it had a story as long as the river. They listened. The three notes returned, each one like a bird lifting off the water, and underneath them the same voices, men's, women's, arguing about channels and apertures, about whether the bridge should be used as instrument or remain infrastructure. The voice that spoke the line, "We can make the bridge listen," had more edges than the others. It carried the confidence of someone who'd tested a rule and found a loophole in moral law. "We've got logs," June said when the reel finished, turning toward some humming cabinet that had the winters of a dozen administrations inside. "But the digital index starts in the 80s. Earlier than that, you have to trust my fingers and a blind eye. I can pull ship manifests and crew rosters. If you're looking for Anchorage as a place, you're doing fine. If you're looking for a code name, you're marrying mystery to myth." They worked like people who shared a hunger. They read manifests aloud, looked through weather reports, pulled out ancient acoustic surveys that used language like bearing and attenuation, and drew diagrams that looked like experiments with calm brutality. In one brittle folder labeled Marigold, Survey Logs, 1978 to 1980, they found a memo stamped with the same corporate mark they'd seen in the ledger: Aegis Marine, Contract Phase 2. Someone had scribbled in pencil across the bottom: "Tests moved offshore. Do not broadcast." "There's a name here," Noah said, running his finger down a typed line as if it might still tell him a secret. "Commander Jory Keane. Technical lead. Recommended sensitive handling." Zara read it twice and then a third time because names are elastic and sometimes tell you what they still owe you. The face in the Polaroid from the Marigold was strict with weather and yet oddly familiar. The hollow at his cheekbone made Zara think of someone she had known in a past life of music and small betrayals. She tasted the memory. A violin's E-string, overtones, the patience it takes to make a thing sing. For a second she felt absurdly young and then suddenly very old, like grief sharpened by detail. They stacked documents until their arms ached. They found a report from an internal Aegis audit complaining about unmanaged acoustic feedback and recommending termination of experimental runs. They found correspondences that read like arguments between people who had once been colleagues and then learned how to be strangers. Legal language softening guilt. There was one line in a margin, handwritten and hurried, that made the room tilt. Project audio syncs to bridge cables, possible resonance. Do not proceed without oversight. On the next slip a different hand had scrawled, proceed. Controlled. Benefit outweighs risk. Benefit to whom? Zara asked aloud. June looked at her like so many archivists have looked at people who mistake patience for stupidity. Companies with patents to sell, she said. And people who measure value in leverage, not lives. They left the vault with copies on a flash drive Noah had smuggled in his camera bag, a small, bright theft that felt righteous. Outside the air tasted like salt and municipal paint. The city had pressed down into fog again and was kind enough to be mysterious. On the ride back, Noah drove like a man who'd learned to make improvisations his business plan. He pulled the van into a side street that smelled of tar and yesterday's rain. "We should check CCTV," he said. "Not the good cameras, the ones that are cheaply mounted. If someone was toggling feeds in 1979, they'd have done their work physically. These days you can't hide a splice without leaving a log." At the studio, they plugged the flash into the workstation and scrubbed through hours of municipal footage. Their eyes hunted for gaps. Gaps in footage are like holes in a net. You notice the missing weight the moment you stop pretending the net is whole. They found them, 3-minute dropouts on the night the Marigold ran a survey. A 15-second blank at 2:41 on a camera mounted under the north span. A feed that restarted with an odd time stamp and no log entry. The pattern was no longer just audio. It had become a choreography. "Someone wants a record of absence," Noah said, rubbing his temple. "If you mask a thing enough, it looks like it never happened." They pulled the raw frames and ran them through noise analysis. The silence in the missing seconds had a faint carrier pattern that matched the 3 notes on the tape. It was the sort of forensic link that made both of them catch their breath. Audio and visual now had the same signature. A signal had been there and then it had not. Somebody was orchestrating what the city remembered. That night Noah left the studio with the flash drive in his pocket and a plan to make copies for safekeeping. Zara wanted to sleep but found herself wide in the way grief makes people watch the world for changes it would not otherwise reveal. She walked the Presidio path and paused where the cypresses thin and the bay shows you what you asked for. The Golden Gate stood like a witness. For the first time in years she allowed herself to listen properly. The low thrum of traffic, the muffled horn of a distant ship, the soft, impossible 3 notes leaking through the fog like a half-remembered lullaby. At 2 in the morning a sound struck her differently, a vehicle idling too long, a truck taking a corner with more patience than a delivery man needs. She turned, and in the distance a pair of headlights held like eyes in the dark. A figure moved by a shadowed bench and then melted into it. Zara wanted to follow, but something in her told her the city's patterns are patient. They can wait for you to make the next wrong move. The next afternoon Noah's studio was a small crime scene. The door latch had been forced. Camera bags were slashed. The workstation lay on its side, screens cracked, audio gear carelessly strewn. Noah's prized recorder, the one he used to test noise on ferries and at festivals, had been taken. Whoever had come had not needed everything. They had looked for a thing specific. The flash drive no longer sat atop the desk. No signs of forced entry beyond the door, Priya said when she arrived, boots leaving polite marks in dust. Her face, usually a map of professional composure, had a crease of annoyance. "You people know to back up off-site," she said, because cops like to convert philosophy into orders. "I had it on me," Noah said, voice flat as paper. "I put it in my jacket and went." He felt implicated the way someone guilty of trusting always feels implicated. "Someone came after it," Priya said. "Because of this?" She flicked the screen and let one of the fragmented audio files play. The 3 notes arrived, sharper in the damaged footage. Under it, a new sound, a female voice, soft and urgent, saying, "We can make the bridge listen." In the recording the voice cracked on listen as if the word carried too much. Zara felt the old ache bloom in a new shape, a mapping between a sentence on a tape and a person who had once been close enough to tune a violin to her breath. She remembered the man who had called once in the middle of a tour and sounded distant. She remembered a goodbye that had started as work. She'd never known what had happened to him, but names have a gravity. Keen pulled at that gravity like a ship on a line. Who would want it? Noah asked, trying to make the question scientific. Who would break in and take a drive? A private company? A nostalgic collector? People with resources and secrecy, Priya said. People who treat infrastructure like a toy. People who could make a device look like a test and then weaponize the result. "You think Aegis?" Noah asked. Priya's eyes hardened. "I think Aegis has history. I think anyone who sees the city as a set of controls could be tempted. But break-ins rarely happen without a hand on the inside or a price paid to someone who likes being useful." Zara thought of the thin line in the old report, "Proceed. Controlled. Benefit outweighs risk." She thought of corruptible calculations and how they sometimes present themselves as simple arithmetic. Profit minus conscience equals action. Her hands tightened around the edge of a chair the way someone who had once tuned a violin tightened fingers around a bow. That night she kept the tape by her bed and slept little. She let herself imagine the man in the photograph, Jory Keane, older, perhaps broken, perhaps living with the decisions others had made for him. She pictured him in the glow of an instrument panel, hands finding harmonics, speaking into a mic. "We can make the bridge listen." The sentence rolled over and over, like a needle looping in a groove. Noah, meanwhile, made a careful list of who might want the drive. He cross-checked donors, contractors, and the kind of private foundations that liked to fund forgotten things. He thought of old engineers who'd once been proud to see their work used and had later been ashamed. He called Gus, an elderly maintenance man with an affection for analog gear, who answered the phone from between the din of a repair bench and offered, in a voice made of small kindness, a single phrase, "You don't mess with the gate unless you're ready to answer to the water." Words take on the weight of omen when they're repeated by people who mean them. Trust between Zara and Noah tightened into something more complicated after the break-in. He felt guilty for carrying the flash. She felt guilty for not sensing the danger. Both felt a new, raw awareness of how fragile the small network they'd built really was. In a life that had been measured by the length of sustained note, this ragged rhythm felt like an unfinished movement. "You could have left it at the Port Authority," Zara said one morning, handing him a mug of mildly burnt coffee as if their domesticity might be the anchor to steady them. "No," he said, surprised by his own fierceness. "I should have. I thought I was being clever. I thought I was making sure it was safe." He ran his hand through his hair and looked younger than his years and older than his newsfeed. I never should have trusted that my jacket was a vault. She let him have a moment to be small. Trust is a muscle. Sometimes you have to let it tremble to know it still works. She slid the tape from her bag and set it between them on the table like a tiny truce. We don't make the same mistake twice, she said. They both meant it. They had to mean it. Because someone was rewriting what the city would remember and erasing who it would hold responsible. And because the name Jory Keane had a way of acting like a key, it slipped a lock and found another lock to fit. The next morning Zara woke to a voicemail she did not want to hear but had expected. The voice was low and oddly polite. Ms. Bennett, my name is Carter Malloy. I work for Aegis. I think you have something that belongs to us. Might we speak privately? The message ended with a number and an offer of civility. Zara held the phone like it was a small animal and then put it down. She thought of May's careful notes, of the tape that had waited under the mug, and of a city that had a way of asking questions in ways that made answering dangerous. She thought of the figure she'd seen on the bluff and how watching becomes a job when you trade curiosity for survival. Noah wanted to run to the Port Authority and demand every log and every signature. Priya wanted to get a warrant and a list of every contracted engineer. June wanted to lock the vault and throw away the key. But what they could do in that afternoon was smaller, quieter, and possibly more useful. They could build redundancy. Copies would be made and stashed. People who were careful would be warned. Cameras would be set in places where darkness could not be bought. And they would ask the Bay to lend them ears. As they moved that day to set up new microphones and patch their own network of listening posts, Zara felt grief and anger fold into something angular and true, a kind of devotion that prefers questions over answers and keeps asking until the city has to stop pretending not to hear. She could feel Noah at her side like a second set of ears. She could feel Priya's patience like a law waiting to be enforced. The team's smallness made a new kind of courage, practical, stubborn, and, when necessary, a private violence that refused spectacle. At sunset, as fog pulled a curtain across the bridge and the cables gleamed like the skeleton of a giant instrument, an email arrived in Zara's inbox. It had no subject line. The body was a single sentence. Stop tuning the gate, or the water will answer for you. Below the line, as a signature, a single initial, J.K. She looked at Noah, at the message, and for the first time the face in the Polaroid became a living shape that could still sign its threats. The archive had given them pieces of the past. The present, they now knew, would not be polite. They set microphones that night in pairs, in threes, on buoys and on the bluff, under bridges and in the hollow of the Presidio's pine. They fed them to recorders hidden in lunchboxes and old coolers, to make the city into a distributed ear. If someone wished to hide a signal by erasing cameras and stealing drives, then the city would have to hold witnesses the way a congregation holds a hymn. When the first recordings came in at 3 a.m, the 3 notes were clearer than ever, and beneath them, a tone that was not mechanical but marine, a low undercurrent like a whale's sigh or a distant engine, one that did not belong to the bridge cables but to the water itself. Zara listened and felt, in the precise part of her body that keeps time, that the next move would not be made by people alone. The city had a memory that ran under its pavements. The Bay kept its own ledger, and whatever had begun as an experiment had rooted itself into that ledger like a planted seed. She did not know whether Jory Keane had written the note to warn them or to drown them in more story. She only knew that the initial had the power to be both apology and threat. Outside, beyond the studio's thin windows, something in the fog scratched like a pen on paper. The city had begun to answer, and it was not yet clear whether the answer would be music or warning. They learned quickly that companies don't move in daylight. Aegis owned the polite hours and rented the rest, the curtained rooms where decisions accrue margins. When the legal letter arrived, it read like guidance for a future that had already been paid for, polite, firm, and structured to be impossible to argue in public. Carter Malloy's insistence that they return the material for review was a paper glove slipped over a fist. Zara read the email twice, then a third time, and felt the old instinct stir. When someone in a suit asks to meet, they're asking to see how small you are. Noah wanted to shout. Priya wanted to serve a warrant. Zara folded the screen shut and thought instead about listening. How do you meet force? You make sure it can be heard. They built redundancy into their plan like a fort builder stacks sandbags. Copies spread across different drives. Recorders hidden in places Aegis wouldn't think to look. An old lifeboat locker at the museum, a utility box behind a diner's dumpster, a locked case in June's vault. Noah scrubbed footage into offline archives. June printed microfilm copies and put one inside May's teacup collection. Priya leaned on procedure. She filed a request for access logs, demanded a review of maintenance contracts, and quietly used her badge to open doors that had been sealed by bureaucracy. Aegis answered with lawyers and an executive whose LinkedIn looked like a monument. Publicly, they were a contractor with a sterling safety record and a sunset-colored logo. Privately, Carter Malloy sent a man who smelled of aftershave and resolved things with phrases like reputational risk and regulatory compliance. His first visit to the Presidio cottage ended with a clipboard and a smile and an offer of retention, as if buying silence were an accounting entry. When that failed, they tried threats. Zara received a spacing of notes, thin, typed, and signed. The language shifted from courteous to clinical. Leave matters of infrastructure to professionals. You are trespassing on contracts. It read like someone turning a polite tap into a slow bleed. Noah's equipment was vandalized again. This time the recorder's casing had a message scratched into it with a pocket knife. Heard enough. That night Zara packed the small duffel she used for field work and put May's reel at the center, like a heart it needed to protect. She found Noah waiting with a map and a soft, bleak grin. They're tightening a net, he said. Not draped in steel but in procedure. They'll muddy the water with paper while someone moves quietly. Priya moved with a different tempo. She dressed not for cameras but for consequence. She called in favors, a reluctant magistrate here, a technician at the port there, and began to pin Aegis in a way that paperwork likes, with deadlines and subpoenas. She was the kind of person who trusted forms because forms have teeth when the state agrees to bite. They built the sting in 3 parts: an evidence net, a live expose, and a tactical recovery. The evidence net was sonic. Dozens of hidden hydrophones and contact mics, looped and redundantly recorded so that no single vandal could erase the sound. The live expose was a planned broadcast. They would hijack a community radio slot, stream to a dozen local podcasts, and push a mirrored feed to social platforms, eyes as witnesses, traveling fast enough to make it costly for Aegis to ignore. The tactical recovery was Priya's masterpiece. She would obtain warrants to search any site Aegis had used for ad hoc tests. She would deploy officers undercover. She would freeze assets if needed. There was danger in scale. Aegis could flood the zone with suits and lawyers and public statements that made them look like overzealous citizens. It could also, quietly, reach into the underbelly of the city and hire muscle who knew the docks and the catwalks and how to disappear a person without leaving a paper trail. They had, in short, everything that moves in polite circles and also the hands that move quietly. The schedule was audacious and necessary. Aegis had announced a planned acoustic calibration the week after next, officially for bridge maintenance. The city had signed off. Official channels meant the state was participating, which meant arrests had to be surgical. It also meant that if Aegis was planning to repurpose the test, to transform the calibration into an active signal, then the test was public and they could put a microphone where it counted. They rehearsed the rehearsal. Arya would have been proud of their blocking. Priya's men would be posted on service lifts and maintenance tunnels. Noah would livestream. June would patch the audio into the radio slot. Zara and a small recovery team would ride the catwalk, mindful of cable anchors and rusted bolts, because the reality of the Golden Gate's underbelly is that it's a working spine and not merely a postcard. On the day, fog rolled in like it had a plan. Visibility dropped to a thick plate glass gray, headlamps through cones of light that vanished into nothing. The bridge's cables were necklaces against the sky, and their metal sang in a way Zara knew intimately, a harmonic that could be measured, shaped, and in the wrong hands weaponized. They positioned their devices. Hydrophones tucked in fender lines below the bridge, contact mics clamped on service beams, a tiny broadcast rig hidden inside an old inspection hatch that June had the key for. Priya's officers blended into maintenance crews with jackets and clipboards. Carter Malloy watched from across the water in a corporate boat with tinted glass, his posture the exact kind of indifference that is practice for privilege. Noah went live. He read a short intro, low and steady. We're here to document the calibration. If something unusual happens, we'll record it. If someone repurposes this event, we'll hold the feed. The stream went to a few thousand in minutes. Public curiosity likes the smell of government doing potentially dangerous experiments. At 3 o'clock the first phase began. Technicians climbed and checked anchors and monitors. An inspector with a government badge read off tolerances like scripture, torque, resonance, allowable variance. Zara watched the instruments. Under her fingers the readings were honest. The frequencies moved in the expected range. Then, at 3:27, they saw a drop in the control feed. A single, tiny blip, a data hole no one had scheduled. Priya's hand tightened on her radio. "We have an unscheduled input," said one of her men, voice clipped. Channel 3 was toggled. "I'm locking it down." The fog thickened. On Noah's feed the audience swelled. Comments raced. Someone on the stream flagged a boat approaching against protocol. It was a private vessel. Carter Malloy's boat, their cover confirmed. The private boat drifted near the maintenance zone like a shark with a briefcase. Priya's officers inshore signaled and were met with lawyers and excuses. Malloy kept his boat's deck tidy and showed a corporate smile like a shield. At 3:33 the technicians initiated test pulses. The 3 notes echoed across the bridge like a summons. For a brief second, it sounded like the city was tuning itself. Everyone in the planning room held a breath because in the exact instant of resonant coupling, instruments that measure are instruments that decide. And then the sound shifted. Beneath the 3 notes there was a second tone, a low warble that matched the water's undercurrent and a sequence of frequencies that fit the pattern on May's tape. Zara felt it in her teeth, old text speaking in the voice of the ocean. The readings glitched. An onboard console flashed a warning, resonant anomaly detected. Malloy smiled as if to say the anomaly was a success. Priya's radio crackled with an order and a frustration. Hold position. Do not engage unless there is imminent danger. The problem with legal restraint is it assumes the opponent will behave honorably. The problem with opponents like Aegis is they don't need honor when they have leverage. On the catwalk a shape moved in the fog. Not an official technician, not a maintenance worker. A hooded figure slipped along a support beam and climbed an access ladder like someone familiar with the structure's private grammar. Priya's backup team moved, but the figure was quick, a shadow with purpose. Noah, camera wide, caught a hint of a hand on a device, a sound projector camouflaged to look like test kit, and then the figure vanished into a maintenance hatch. Zara, who knew how sound behaved on metal and on wind, watched the instrument spike. The tone doubled down, not as a pure harmonic but as a pattern that seemed to lock onto a phase of the bridge's resonant field. The metal thrummed louder, a vibration you could put your palm on and feel the truth. People with training felt that truth like a physical fact. Resonance doesn't ask permission, it just is. Something in the crowd on shore began to shout. Someone posted a video of the beam humming and tagged it with a phrase no one liked. Weaponized resonance. Panic moves like a rumor, it wants faces. Comments demanded action. For a moment the human shape of the internet behaved like a jury. Priya lunged to act. She ordered a lockdown and simultaneous approach teams. They moved toward the maintenance hatch where the hooded figure had gone. The hatch, someone realized, had been tampered with. The internal ladder had fresh grease unlike the rest of the corroded steps. When they opened it, they didn't find a saboteur waiting with a smug smile. They found instead a small field kit, wires, small speakers, a device modified to feed an analog loop back into the bridge's sensor net. It had been set to broadcast a sequence payload, an audible signature that would resonate along cable harmonic nodes and, in the worst-case projection, potentially amplify at points that could shake loose fittings, create panic, and cause structural stress. It was not a bomb. It did not need to be. It needed only to make the bridge do what the city feared, sing itself into trouble. The kit wore no fingerprints, only a caution of being placed by someone who knew how to dismantle his trails. Priya took pictures. June collected a solder spool. Noah's mic captured one faint thing. A woman's voice, on a hidden recording on the device, whispering the phrase Zara had heard before, "We can make the bridge listen." They traced the modified device's components. Someone at Aegis had access to these parts. They were not common to hobbyists. The logical consequence hung there in cold air. Procurement trails. Who bought the parts and from what account? They had evidence. They had the device. They had public witnesses in the stream. The city shuddered and took notice. Carter Malloy, whose boat had skulked close, called in a lawyer who made assurances and offered cooperation, while spokespeople on his feed said Aegis condemns any malicious activity and will cooperate fully with authorities. The paradox of corporate statements is that they are designed to prevent panic and to resemble accountability without necessarily delivering it. The initial legal moves were swift. Priya signed affidavits. Malloy's company issued a press release about rogue actors. The mayor's office called for calm. Social feeds were a tangle of outrage and conspiracy. But the net they had woven in sound held. Multiple independent recordings, witnesses, and a physical device that attached a pattern to the bridge's resonant field. The device itself had enough serial markings to trace back to a distributor. They followed the paper trail with the kind of careful cruelty law permits. The distributor's invoice was a small, legal note. It led to a shell procurement account, which led to a subcontractor, which led faintly, inevitably, back to Aegis. In public, Aegis denounced the sabotage and offered cooperation. In private, their counsel issued a cease and desist to Noah and Zara that read like a plea: do not publish or broadcast evidence that could compromise ongoing investigations. The legal language was a muzzling rope disguised as civility. At night, when the city was allowed its private noises, Zara walked the bridge with Noah and Priya. The cable's hum had returned to its daily note. Engineers checked Anchorage bolts and documented tolerances. The law moved a careful pace. But the water, the old ledger beneath the tide, had shifted. Whales and tugboats hummed where before there had been a quiet. Heavier things came after. Threats that moved from typed pages to physical intimidation. Noah received a message pushed between two frames of an otherwise unrelated feed, a quick digital smear that contained a photo of his studio's cracked console and the words, "We are watching who listens." A delivery man knocked on Zara's door and left a small package with a single note inside: "Stop asking the gate to sing." The note had no signature, only a looped ink stain like a thumb. They could have walked away. They all had reasons to. Aegis had money, lawyers, and a comfortable inside to which the city's mechanisms tended to return. But they had the taped voice that had spoken in May's kitchen, the Polaroid with Jory Keane's face, and the memory of a man made of music who had gone missing. Quit was for other people. They had chosen listening once. They could not choose not to hear. The net tightened, but it caught more than fingers. It also caught a pattern: procurement orders, the same parts in different maintenance kits, an employee record that listed someone with initials JK on a contractor roster. The trail was faint and inconvenient, but it was enough. Priya filed for a grand jury hearing and slapped together a probable cause brief that read like a rope tying a company to acts. The moment industry lawyers learned about subpoenas, the tenor of pressure shifted again, not raw intimidation but preemptive compliance. Malloy called a press conference and offered interviews and the image of cooperation. "We condemn unlawful activity," he said, the sentence polished to a shine. "We will work with law enforcement." Aegis released logs showing contracts cancelled, employees reassigned, and a public statement saying they had no knowledge of modified devices. But in private, Carter Malloy made an appointment with a man in a dark suit and had a conversation without witnesses about liability and a single, simple solution: buy the story. Offer money for silence. Offer a fund for the city. Offer compensation for danger. Money is a polite weapon. It does not burn the way a bullet does, and it often buys the silence that bureaucracies mistake for peace. Noah refused the meeting. Zara refused the envelope that ended up on her porch, thick with bills and a letter that read like a proposal for forgetting. Priya told them to be careful. Companies with deep reach can be dangerous. Do not be naive. She believed in law, but she also understood people in suits often play an entirely different game in the hours when officialdom sleeps. The net tightened at the edges, but in the center their small group had friends who mattered. June found an old contact in an equipment shop outside the city who remembered Jory Keane and told a story about a man who had been curious and unafraid, who'd once refused to sign off on a test because it felt wrong. Rex, who had fixed a relay in another life, dug into procurement trails and found a single invoice with an employee name and a job code: ambient testing, Aegis Project 79B. The initials were rough but legible: JK. They were pulling a thread. The question was how deep it went and whether the city would allow them to pull it until someone else peeled back with countervailing power. In the last hours before action, when the city wore the thin white of fog like a veil, Zara and Noah sat on the Presidio bluff and listened. The three notes came, faint as breath, threaded into the night. But beneath them, like a buried drum, was something else now. A long, low tone had settled into the bay. It was not a human voice nor a mechanical tick. It was a pressure, the feeling you get in your bones before a tremor. Zara felt it like a low metronome counting down. Whatever JK was trying to stop or start, she said quietly, it's still out there. Aegis had reasons to keep it tidy. People did it for profit. Someone else might have done it to keep something quiet. Noah took her hand. It was a small, tender anchor in a world that kept asking them to be brave on someone else's terms. Priya joined them with a folder of warrants, not happy but resolute. We move at first light, she said. We take what we can on paper and make sure the city hears the truth in public. They slept reluctantly, if at all. Waking to a city that was both beautiful and dangerous felt like waking into duty. The sting, they knew, would make things worse and maybe better. It would expose people who had power to action and might scare the timid into generosity or violence. Morning arrived like an ultimatum. The fog was thin, the sky a washed plate, the cables of the bridge in outline. Priya's officers were in place, monitored, ready. Noah adjusted his camera gimbal. June carried a set of microfilm copies like a priest carrying an artifact. Rex stood by the lot with a small crate of parts that had once been innocent. Carter Malloy called to say he supported the investigation. The mayor's office called to ask for calm. When they moved, it was not a rush but a carefully measured set of blows. Priya's team served warrants and escorted technicians away from Aegis lots. Investigators logged procurement ledgers found in cubicles. Forensics quarantined emails. Around noon they entered a small storage site off the pier and found a locker labeled with a date in 1979. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, they found a file marked JK and a small reel-to-reel spool with a note. For the water. It was a record like a confession that had remained private for 40 years. When June played it in a secure room, the tape crackled and a voice, older, worn, unmistakable, said, "We wanted to make it stop. We thought if the gate listened we could tell her what to forget." A second voice, younger, answered, "You can't ask a bridge to cover a crime." There was a long silence. Then, quiet as a man folding a letter, "We had to bury it." They had found a buried ledger and a confession that linked Aegis contractors and a set of choices made in the name of progress. The public record shifted. Priya had what she needed for grand jury testimony. The city watched as the veil lifted in small, legal motions. In the end, the net tightened and then pulled taut. Aegis moved to protect its brand. Carter Malloy resigned from a committee he'd loved and announced an internal review. Employees were questioned. Investigations were public. The press chewed and spat and chewed again. But the city did not unravel. It listened and then filed. It is not always a satisfying arc, sometimes it is a necessary one. And yet, at night, when the fog came back like a hand covering a lamp, Zara still heard a low, patient hum under the water. The device found at the maintenance hatch had been stopped. The public records showed culpability for procurement and for seeming over anomalies. But the sea keeps what it wants. People make choices and the water keeps its own ledger. Noah and Zara learned that the fight wasn't only about power but about noise, what you allow to be heard and what you let be buried. They had property in the city now, a history that mattered and the voices to say it aloud. They had friends who could read legal documents and set microphones and stand in court. And they had, finally, an answer to the question of whether they would stop listening. They had not yet found Jory Keane. But they had found his initials in invoices and his voice in a confession. That was enough to move the law and, perhaps, to move the stubborn institutions that had pretended not to hear. The city began to sing back in small ways. Hearings scheduled, oversight panels formed, maintenance crews audited, and the strange, private man who signed his threats as J.K. no longer had the privileged opacity of someone whose papers were buried alive. At night, after hearings and interviews and the slow burn of bureaucratic accountability, Noah and Zara sat in May's kitchen and listened to a new recording, a copy of the reel marked for the water. They played it softly, not to relive a crime but to remember the way people sometimes tried to do good badly and the way small courage finally caught up. The voice on the reel spoke of fear and error and a hope that an engineered silence might keep people safe. Maybe he wanted to stop something, Noah said, rubbing his hands as if to warm them. Maybe he thought by hiding it he was protecting us. Or maybe everyone convinced themselves they had good reasons, Zara replied. Either way, we found the ledger. They slept then, in the exhausted way people do after a long, complicated victory. Romance softened into a companionable warmth. Late-night tea, elbows on the table, the simple peace of someone who understands why you move in the dark. They had more to do, subpoenas, testimony, repairs to the moral fabric of institutions. But for the moment, the net had trapped more than fear. It had caught a few truths and kept them where they could be seen. Outside, in the harbor, the water carried its hum. The bridge still held. The city listened and slowly, painstakingly answered back. They called it the signal because calling it anything else felt like domestication. Aegis called it a calibration. The city called it a hazard and a headline. Jory Keene's reel called it a memory you could not unhear. For Zara, Noah, and Priya it became, in the last tidy hours before everything broke, the thing they had been building toward. A public proving of what had happened under the pretense of maintenance. The plan was simple on paper and wide and fragile in practice. June would patch the For the Water reel into the community radio feed for exactly 7 minutes, 40 seconds longer than Vaughn's theatrical offers, short enough to be a clip, long enough to make the city listen. Noah would run the live stream and the backup feeds. Priya would put officers where movement mattered. Zara would ride the catwalk and watch instruments like a conductor watching an orchestra she did not trust. They would play Jory's confession in public, then play the device's collected logs and the procurement trail June had wrestled from the vault. The aim was not only to shame Aegis, it was to make the city itself a witness in real time, to create an audience whose curiosity could not be bought. At first light the bridge wore fog like a cloak. The Golden Gate's towers emerged, 2 islands in gray. Work crews arrived with clipboards, some startled to find law enforcement IDs among them. Priya moved with that efficient calm that makes people think there is always a plan before there is one. She had coordinated with the district attorney in a voice that ceded nothing and with the mayor's office in a tone that everyone later described as necessary friction. Public safety carved out paths for media vans. Noah's live rig hummed like a small animal. June's patch was a tidy knot of cables that would carry decades-old voice into phones and radios and internet windows across the city. They called it at 8:30. Noah's voice, always better at low temperatures, spoke into a microphone and made a small human set of rules. We are not here to inflame. We are here to document. If you hear something that matters, contact authorities. This feed is being recorded by multiple independent outlets. His last words were a soft promise to Zara, a look, a half-smile, then he went live. June cued the reel. Jory's voice came out of speakers that had long ago learned to be honest. He sounded older than his photograph, older than the man in the Marina Polaroid. He sounded like someone who had meant to make amends but had been given only paper and secrecy in return. We started this because the sea was quiet, Jory's recorded voice said, hesitant and raw. We were young and thought controlling silence would protect people. We were wrong. We made something that could be used to coerce. We hid it because we were afraid of the consequence of telling the world. I buried it because I thought the water could keep the secret better than anyone's conscience. It didn't keep the secret, it kept the sound. There were listeners who counted the seconds visually, hush in the comments, numbers scrolling, and listeners who only felt the tape in their chests. Noah's stream climbed into the tens of thousands. 100 small stations relayed the audio. A mayoral aide texted his supervisor, already calculating damage control. Carter Malloy's phone, the one with the polite voicemail, started to ring in a way that could not be ignored by a jailer's patience. Under the real, June threaded documents and a transcript into the feed, ledger entries, procurement invoices, the chain of custody for the modified devices. They played the clip of Priya opening the maintenance hatch and the hidden kit found there, the dim recording of the woman's whisper, the same line Zara had first heard in May's kitchen. "We can make the bridge listen." The feed had a side effect they hadn't calculated. People who had been hushed for years found their voice. A retired deckhand recognized a voice on the tape as someone he'd worked with in 1979 and called the number June had given on the air. A man who'd moved small things for contractors, parts, crates, odd bits, realized a ledger entry matched a job he'd helped do, and for the first time in decades, his hands grew heavy with the idea of saying the truth. The retired deckhand, a blunt man named Marco Alvarez, found a place in front of a courthouse microphone within hours. He did not dress like a witness. He looked like someone who had been woken at the wrong part of the night. "I shipped crates for those men," he said into the open air and on the stream. "Sometimes I didn't ask questions. Sometimes you don't ask because you need the work. But one night, we took a crate down in a boat. It was heavy. Someone told us it was crates for the bridge test. I saw Jory then, he looked scared. He told me the box had a noise in it. I thought he meant a pump or a motor. I didn't think to listen. I should have." The public confession cracked something open. Marco's name in a story was a small, scalding thing. Someone who admitted help, didn't know what it would do. His testimony mattered because it changed culpability from a distant boardroom to hands that had handled parts and kept their mouths shut. Word spread. The DA convened a hearing that afternoon. Priya signed additional affidavits. Aegis, cornered, scheduled a press conference. Carter Malloy stepped to a podium under lights and read a prepared statement of cooperation. He sounded practiced. The cameras ate his confidence and held it up for their viewers to dissect. Noah's stream threaded the press statements with the raw materials they had: Jory's reel, the device, Marco's witness. People argued fiercely online. Some tried to defend Aegis as an industrial victim of rogue actors. Others, newly angry, demanded immediate arrests. The city leaned in. That leaning was what had been missing from Jory's years, attention that did not come with a price tag. At dusk, just when the whole spectacle risked becoming theater instead of justice, the arc crooked. An unmarked boat cut into the bay under a blanket of fog. Priya's shore teams tensed. Cameras swung. Carter Malloy, who had been theatrically available all day, was suddenly on his yacht calling lawyers. The pattern of a corporation trying to move fast became clear. By time, muddy record, file motion. Aegis's legal team issued a statement about internal review and not tolerating rogue activity, but it rang thin. People heard the thinness on the radio. And then someone took a step Noah had not wanted. A man in a dark jacket tried to board one of the boats in the maintenance flotilla. Priya's team moved with economy and speed honed by training. Officers closed in. There was a scuffle on deck and then the sound of a body hitting metal. Noah, who had been repositioning a camera, ran to help and found a man who was less of a stranger than he'd looked. A contractor on the payroll, eyes wide with fear. It was enough to tie procurement trails to a human presence. Under the rush of the evening, outside the official chambers where lawyers recalculated their talking points, something dangerous still needed stopping. The low hum in the bay, the one that had become a small drumbeat in Zara's bones, had not been entirely quelled. The modified kit they found on the bridge had been disabled. Its parts were in evidence. But the water remembers. Tests leave scarred patterns in marine networks. The reel had named a wrong. The city responded with law. But the sea stayed. The moment that simplified everything, that demanded courage beyond paperwork, came when a junior tech on Priya's team warned of a secondary signal pulsing from under a maintenance pier. The sensors on the catwalks had picked up a rising harmonic beneath the bridge near Pier 40. It was not tied to the device they'd recovered. It was new, small, and musical in a way that fascinated and terrified Zara. A pattern that nested into the natural frequencies of the bridge but was being emitted from deep water lines. Priya ordered quiet. The officers moved with tiny lamps and taped boots. Noah patched their handheld to the stream so people could hear what they were about to hear. A low, pure hum that rose and bowed like a cello string plucked slowly underwater. It was beautiful in the way danger sometimes is. It made listeners go still. "This is not a device," the junior tech whispered into a microphone. "This is something else." "The water's responding." Zara felt her breath thin. The whole of their work had been predicated on human malice and corporate concealment. The idea that the bay might have been altered by patterns and now return a response was an old scientist's nightmare dressed as myth. She knew, in a way that had nothing to do with proof, how to stop something that vibrated, counterphase. You play the inverse and the note cancels. The problem was practical. How do you broadcast a counterphase from a catwalk without amplifying the hum? How do you keep people safe when your solution is essentially making the bridge do nothing extraordinary but the bay has already been trained to behave like an instrument? Zara did the only thing she could. She climbed. She climbed with the steadiness of the person who spends hours listening to bow against gut. The catwalk was a narrow spine and the fog made every step feel ceremonial. Priya's team rigged a tether. Noah followed with a camera on a stabilized boom. They carried a small transmitter, a device June and Gus had cobbled that could generate an inverse frequency across a limited band. They tested it at the edge of the maintenance hatch and found, in the speakers, a small cancellation that made the local readings dip like a tide receding. "Do it carefully," Priya said, voice taut. "We cut power if anything goes wrong." Zara pressed the play. The transmitter emitted a counterphase designed to interfere only at the frequency of the hum. The readings on the monitors stuttered. For a small, glorious second the hum and the counterphase folded into each other and the sound died a neat, surgical death. The instruments registered calm. The water did not rise or roar. It simply, astonishingly, stopped. Then a shout. A small explosion of people. Noah saw, out near the pier, someone moving too quick, a hand reaching for something small and metallic, new gear, an attempt to reinitiate a feed. Priya's team surged. In the scuffle Noah stepped forward to grab a hand that looked like a trigger. He misjudged distance. A body pitched. A hard edge of metal took him across the abdomen. He went down with a curse, breath leaving like a punched note. For one terrifying second there was only noise, shouts, foghorns, the city's pulse rising fast. Zara turned from the transmitter to him. She saw the blood dark on his shirt and the way his face had gone suddenly smaller. Her hands moved the way hands do when they have practiced emergency. Pressure, a field dressing tied with fingers used to finer things than knots. Priya barked orders and then her voice shifted to the calm of someone saving a person in public. Names, numbers, a promise to get him to the ambulance. Noah watched her with a kind of clarity that was brutally honest. "You stopped it," he said when he found breath to speak, a grin curved around the pain. "You always did." Zara laughed once, wet and sharp. "Don't say heroic things until the medics decide you're not a headline," she replied. He made a sound and then, because the city likes stories with stitches, he smiled and said, "We'll argue about the music later." The scuffle yielded a man with a procurement badge and a voicemail full of corporate contacts. Priya's team made rapid arrests, not only of the man who had tried to restart the feed but of agents who traced back to a subcontractor on Aegis's ledger. Carter Malloy, surprised by the public will that had become undeniable, found lawyers less persuasive than an angry public and more persuasive than he expected when subpoenas and witness testimony came in waves. The DA moved quickly. Aegis's PR machine moved more slowly, and the city decided, in the court of public attention, to keep listening. Noah was stitched in an emergency tent with a grin and a suture of the kind that marks a man who has lived enough to tell stories. He refused to be hospital monument, preferring instead the smaller indignity of bandages and a pot of tea in May's kitchen. Priya filed reports that would carry weight in court. June handed over microfilm and receipts like tea leaves that finally read clean. The legal arc bent toward consequences. Procurement records traced a route from the shell company to a Bayside operations manager at Aegis. Marco Alvarez's testimony opened a door that had been closed by time. Jory Keene's reel, played in public, made the story personal. Anonymous threats and corporate statements could not erase the sound of a man telling the truth into a microphone he had himself recorded. The DA indicted several contractors and a procurement manager. The public called for broader oversight. They won in small, compossible ways: arrests that meant charges, hearings that meant accountability, a safety audit that finally made the bridge's maintenance public and transparent. Jory Keane's name was cleared of the implication that he had weaponized the bridge for profit. The record, now public, made his choices complicated but no longer invisible. And yet, victory was not a clean thing. Even after the device was dismantled and the corporate veil pulled back, the bay kept a residue. The hum that had been a threat settled into a low background note not fully erased. Scientists called it a warped resonance. Poets called it a living memory. The city called it the sound it hadn't known it had lost. Zara listened and understood that some things don't end so much as change register. In the weeks after, the legal wheels turned with a steady, grinding righteousness. Aegis paid fines and restructured procurement oversight. Carter Malloy resigned with a statement about regret and lessons learned. Priya received commendations and took a long, deserved vacation where she slept in a bed that did not know a radio. Noah recovered in fits and naps and returned with a scar that made journalists ask if the story had been worth blood. He never wavered in his yes. The more fragile victory was personal. Zara and Noah began to stitch a life that did not pretend danger would never knock. They made small rituals: coffee at noon at Maze, walks along the Presidio, late-night listening sessions where they tried, with varying degrees of success, not to map every sound to a conspiracy. Love between two people who had borne danger together is less a miracle than a decision you have to renew. They renewed it day by careful day. Months later, when the trial against Aegis's implicated contractors began, when the DA put documents into the public record and the city council passed new infrastructure transparency laws, Zara stood on a low bluff and listened. The hum in the bay was quieter now, more complex, less menacing. She'd come to think of it as a string that could be plucked. She brought a small team of sound artists and engineers and proposed something the lawyers would call a cultural reclamation, a sound installation along the waterfront that would translate the bay's low, patient hum into music so people would have to listen to it as beauty rather than fear. They told the city they would not erase the memory, they would make it a memory that taught. They put sensors in buoys and patches of shoreline speakers and invited children from local schools to design the visualizations. The installation, called the Listening Gate, opened on a chilly spring morning. People came with coffee and dogs and cameras. The installation did not pretend to be restitution. It offered instead a new habit: listening as public work. When the opening played the translated hum, people fell quiet in a way the city rarely did. It was not a revelatory hush, but a communal one, the ordinary people of a place choosing to be adult witnesses. A few older men in the crowd had worked the ports and squinted at the speakers. Marco Alvarez stood near the front and folded his hands. He had said things in court that had hurt and freed him. He smiled small and let the sound be what it was. A tide turned into tone. Zara stood with Noah at the back and felt, in the place music lives in the body, a rightness. She had not wanted a martyr or a show. She had wanted the city to remember without being used. The project did not unmake what had been done. It made a place where the city practiced being awake. Weeks later, in the privacy of May's cottage, Noah pulled out a tiny reel he'd kept from the first days, a backup of the For the Water tape, one of those gifts you carry because some small human part of you thinks preservation and testimony are the same thing. He threaded it on an old deck. The voice, Jory's, spoke again, quieter now as if closer. "If you ever make the gate answer, make sure it's to a song," he said on tape, and the room felt like a note held in exact pitch. Zara listened and then turned to Noah. "We taught the city to sing back," she said. "No," he corrected, smiling in the way people do when they love and still want to be careful with praise. "We taught the city to listen to itself." They kissed, a modest, human thing that had earned the right to be private. Outside, the bay kept its own ledger in waves and the Golden Gate leaned over it like a hand. The low hum never vanished completely. Some echoes run deeper than justice or engineering can fix, but it found other voices, The calls of children at the waterfront installation, the careful hum of treatments in a lab, the safe, stubborn noise of sailors who had decided to tell the truth. In the end, the signal had not been a weapon because someone had wanted spectacle. It had been a wound made by fear and secrecy, and the city had healed it with law, with testimony, and with art. Zara rewired the soundscape into a new kind of map, not one that hides danger in engineering terms but one that names it and teaches people how to make music from it. The last reel sat, neatly boxed, in May's cupboard. They did not play it for show after that. They kept it like a relic you touch in private, a reminder that listening is a responsibility. Outside, the bridge lights blinked like a pulse. The bay breathed, and the city, after a long season of being used as a camera and as a tool, learned, finally, to answer back.